Hi, Alex.
Brenda.
Work with me here, Alex.
Keep me on my toes.
Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Excited about continuing on our series of Story Matters. We've been having a lot of fun trying to communicate an idea that can be a little bit harder, but we say that once you have it in your mind, it can just become such a beautiful framework. And we've also been talking about the fact that we've spent some time thinking about these concepts, looking at them in light of our lives and the lives of others. And so we don't want people to feel overwhelmed. Hopefully we haven't added to anybody's confusion too badly up to this point. We'll try not to today as we enter into competing stories, which is taking us kind of to the next idea when we talk about the grand narrative or God's big story. So far we've established that God's story is one story that provides a comprehensive and unified view of reality and explains the purpose and meaning of life. But today we want to emphasize that God's story is the only true story of the whole world. And we're going to look at how each part of God's story answers some of the biggest questions that every person wants to know. And we would call this a worldview. It's made up of our beliefs and assumptions that we hold that shape our outlook on life. And I think it's interesting to me that not only do we have kind of this innate desire for hero stories, that God has put that in our hearts, but he's also put in our hearts this desire to make sense of life. And so when we start talking about these big worldview questions, we're not just talking about questions that Christians ask.
Right.
We're talking about questions that all people ask and how all people are trying to find answers for these questions.
Yeah, I think we've said this many times before, but Paul Tripp says we're all meaning makers. So as people, humans, we are trying to make meaning of our lives. We are telling ourselves a story every day. And so what we believe is that God's story gives us the answers to these big questions of life, and they become like the big rocks that need to be in place that help us make meaning of our lives. I think it's going to make a lot more sense in the particular when we unpack it, and also when people can see it written out. So we have a handout, and it kind of puts all this in a chart. But the main worldview questions are go according to the parts of the story. So of course the first part of the story is the prologue. And the prologue is our orientation to what is truth, who defines reality. It's an authority question. And it's, like we said, it's a question that everyone is asking. The creation is our formation, and that tells us who we are and what is our purpose. That age-old question of like, why am I here? What am I doing? What's my purpose, and who am I? The fall is the affliction part of our story, where we really ask, why do I have to suffer? Why is life so hard? I think that is a big question. It does not take us long to live on this earth before we realize that life is hard, and we're going to be asking the question, why? Why does it have to be so hard? And then the redemption question comes out of the fall, really, because it's the question of salvation, like who's going to save us from this hardship? Who's going to provide, who or what is going to provide rest or refuge? I messed that up. Refuge and rescue. I can't get my words out today. Who's going to provide refuge and rescue in this suffering, in this affliction? And then restoration is kind of that big question of what is our ultimate? What's our ultimate hope? What's our ultimate goal? Like, what are we living towards? How are we living towards peace and wholeness? And that's a question, we call it, of aspiration, that idea of where is this all headed? What are we aiming for? And what keeps us going?
Yeah, and on our chart, it'd be really helpful if you have the chart maybe in front of you, because you'll be able to see how we put this together. But we also talk about what our main ideas, or what we might call even counseling connections. In other words, these are the big rocks, the big worldview questions that the story answers. But then we know that we have all these other parts of our story. So like in creation, we have marriage, we have work, we have rest, we have a lot, a family. Like there's a lot of things there. And if we go into the fall part of the story, we get into some of the specifics of where we see why we suffer, because we're sinners and because we live in a fallen world and because other people sin against us. And again, we see stories that we can relate to, and we have commandments that are given and promises, and then the same with redemption and so forth. So we've got these big worldview ideas, but then we also have kind of these main ideas underneath those categories as well. And what we want to do is look at the competing stories, because we have a story, but there are also other stories out there. And, our worldview is our interpretive lens. If we can think of it as like literally like glasses we put on. And how we answer the worldview questions really depends on our lens, which glasses we are putting on. And any competing story is going to, that tries to explain life or the meaning of life or what's wrong with man or what's going to save man, that's outside of what God says is truth and reality, it is in fact a competing story. I think I said that. Did I say that right? We're both kind of tongue twisted today, I think. But the reality is all these other stories, I kind of like to look at God's story as maybe being a little bit of an umbrella of this is God's story, and then when we go into competing stories, we kind of leave out from under that umbrella, and then God's story is what brings us back up under the umbrella of his love, of his kingdom, of his the big story of the Bible. And we have to recognize that there's been since the Garden of Eden, Alex, the enemy has sought to undermine God's story and infiltrate the world with counterfeit stories. When Moses was writing the 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books, it was against the backdrop of a lot of other cultures, especially Egypt. And Egypt had thousands of gods and goddesses that dictated what the people were supposed to believe and how they were supposed to live and how they were supposed to treat each other. And we have to remember, God's people spent 400 years being indoctrinated in Egyptian beliefs and culture. And then Moses comes in and like, bam, Shazam. I'm going to tell you this one true story. In the midst of all these competing stories, I think sometimes we read the Bible like this is the only story that's ever been around, or this was the first story that was around. It's like, no, when Moses introduces the story in Genesis, he's introducing it at a time where God's people are coming out of a place where they've really been indoctrinated. And so he's answering now all these worldview questions for them based on God's story. And I do want to just recommend the Bible Project series has a series called Ancient Cosmology, which is basically the stories of origin. And so we'll link that to the show notes as well. But if you kind of just want to know more about some of the backdrop to which the story came into, I think is really fascinating and really helpful for us to understand the context.
I have not seen that one, but everything they do is good. And I think, like you said, we can forget that when we read the Bible, we can forget that this wasn't the only story in the culture. And so I need to watch that Bible
It's a series. I think there's 7 in the series. Really helpful.
So you said when you were talking that we all have a lens, and we each have our own unique lens. I think we need to remember that, just like our glasses are kind of made for us. We have this unique lens, and it's influenced by a myriad of other sources. And so we're kind of putting those in 2 categories. Like we're putting them in the category of cultural and personal. And so what are some cultural influences that shape our thinking that you can think of, Brenda?
I mean, I think the first one that definitely comes to my mind is social media.
Yeah.
And it's quote unquote influencers.
Yeah, they're literally called influencers. So we
can. And it is, of course, I come from a different generation. And so, the fact that somebody can speak well and, excuse me, the fact that somebody can speak well and looks good and has an opinion doesn't necessarily make them an expert on any given subject. And especially, I know in, one of our previous series, we just talked about how wisdom is kind of this idea of knowledge and experience coming together, and something that's often lacking. But I mean, social media is a big one. We don't even realize how much, and with the algorithms that begin to then feed you the things that, you're already looking up, and just all the things that are going on with social media. That's a huge cultural a factor for us.
Well, I have to bring a little balance, because I think our generation and older wants to talk about the influence of social media on the younger generation. But if we're going to be fair, there is also, I think, an equal technological influence on older generations, which is 24/7 news. And I think that, like, a lot of older people can just rail on the younger people on social media, but they forget that they've got news running in their house sometimes all day long, and they think it's not influencing us, and it is. So we're going to give equal billing here to each one.
Let's see, equal insulting opportunities here.
Yes, right. That's right. We'll leave no person unoffended.
Exactly. No, I think you make a great point. I mean, every generation has it. Right. It's interesting to me, just the power of influence with the pen, or now with, whether it's written media, whether it's spoken media, whether it's visual media. It is just very powerful, because words are very powerful. And words shape worldview. Right? Yeah. They influence. So I think about other things like advertising. We're told this is who you are, or you're not going to be who you want to be, or this is your purpose through advertising. Entertainment kind of has that same ability to shape the way we think, the music we listen to, the movies we watch. And again, not all the shaping is bad either. Some of the shaping is really good and really inspiring. Right. I happen to love a lot of entertainment, and I definitely love, I'm a kind of a docuseries kind of girl, but I love real life stories. And a lot of times those are so inspirational, either telling me like, this is really good, or this is not good.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and then we think about personal influences, things like our family of origin or our socioeconomic background, which can become kind of, there's some that kind of cross over this cultural and personal, they kind of bleed together. So socioeconomic background, ethnicity, even our family of origin, where we're situated geographically, can become a cultural and a personal. What other personal influences do you see on our lens?
Well, I mean, I think just friendships, relationships, because we're talking out life in relationships. And so as I'm talking to you, Alex, I'm picking up your views. I'm picking up your worldview, your cultural and your personal views. And that's a positive and a negative, right? I guess, or it's neither positive nor negative, I guess, depending on whether it lines up with God's story is going to determine, what direction it goes in. I think just even traumatic experiences, the way we experience hard times, hardships, can really begin to put a different kind of lens on us. Maybe if you've been hurt by men, then maybe that lens is all men are bad, or, whatever it might be. And then I just think even just messages we tell ourselves become part of that personal influence of the view that we have of the world around us and the people around us as well. So I love what... go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think the thing about it is, like, we could probably list these for the rest of the podcast, because it can become very unique. Your position in the family, your occupation even becomes a lens that you see things through. So there are all these different influences on our lens, and I think what makes it hard is that our lens is so firmly in place, we don't realize that we're wearing that lens.
Yes. Yeah. And that's really, really, really hard, because a lot of it is more caught than taught. Like, my parents didn't sit down and say, this is the worldview we have.
Right.
And I don't walk around really thinking about my worldview. It's not at the forefront of my mind going, what am I thinking right now? Which worldview does that match up with? I'm just kind of going through my life with beliefs and assumptions, taking in information, making meaning of that based on what's already there. Right. And so, and to be honest with you, right, it changes, and it needs to change. If we're Christians, we need to be getting rid of some things that aren't in line with what God says, and replacing those things with a more godly focus. So our new information and new experiences can change us along the way. And I love what researcher George Barnes talks about. He says most Americans blend their beliefs to create a customized worldview, right? So in this worldview, it's just a little bit of that, a little bit of this, kind of mix it all together in the pot. and see what comes out.
Right. Right.
And I will have to say, I mean, I think there's just that part of all of us that a customized worldview can also lend itself more toward like there maybe is no authority in my life, or I get to determine whatever I think is right for me. Mm-hmm. And we see that, of course, very much in our culture and in all, since the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. And I think this can feel really discouraging. And I think there is a good warning here. Like, we do have to remember that we have this lens that we see the world through, and ours is unique. And that we have to be careful that we don't call our unique interpretive lens the interpretive lens. Like, it is not the way to see the world. And that's why we think the series is so important, is because we're trying to continue to orient back to what God says about the world, and then take our lens, take what we believe back to that constantly. And just I think that's why this teaching became so paradigm shifting for me, is because it was like, oh, like, we actually do have a way to begin to see what our lens is and then put the lens of truth on. And I think it's also a warning that we're careful not to make these absolute statements when we haven't, when God's not saying them, where God's not saying these absolute things. Then we have to recognize that, like, we're viewing some of these things through our lens, and we have to be careful not to make the absolute statements ourselves, because that's where we start to get in trouble, that we're actually seeing things from our cultural viewpoint, from our, even the fact that we're men or women, or how our church uniquely taught these things. And so it becomes both a warning and a hope that we have a way of seeing things, that God has given us his word in order for us to understand the world the way he does, to understand the world rightly.
Yes, he's given us a corrective lens.
That's a good way to say it.
Yeah, a corrective lens. Well, we thought we would go back to the storyboard of God's storyboard, his story, and maybe look at one competing view that we can see in American culture, and that's our view of happiness. So we want to kind of walk through, like, when we think about an American view of happiness and how it competes with God's view of what he says true joy, true peace, what shalom looks like. We just wanted to take kind of this thread of happiness from an American cultural view and pull it through. So when we think about Alex's prologue, which is what defines truth and who defines reality, what would we say that how does the American culture speak into that?
Well, I think the American culture is highly individualistic. We're known as a nation of individuals. And so the beginning of the story for most Americans is me. Like, I get to decide what makes me happy. And there's not a lot of maybe even accountability in our American story. We get to do what you always say. We get to bring it all back to ourselves in American cultural view of happiness. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, if we move on to the creation part of an American view of happiness, speaks to who we are and what is our purpose. The first thing that comes to my mind is just that we find so much meaning in what we produce. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of I am what I do. Mm-hmm. I am what I am able to bring to bring to the world, to bring to this situation. Very industrious, very achievement oriented. Like, I think that's a lot of where we find happiness, where we find meaning in the American culture. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think, like, we are about the pursuit of happiness, and we think we find it through our productivity, through how hard we can work, and how we begin to define ourselves by, like you said, by our accomplishments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm all about work hard, play hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Americans are.
That's the great American dream. Let me work hard, and then let me play harder. Yeah. Yes. And
that means even like our rest, like, we don't have a great paradigm for rest in American culture. We have a paradigm for amusement because amusement distracts us from work, but not necessarily the biblical view of like rest is recreation or recreating ourselves. And so rest becomes just distraction more than real biblical rest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then if we look in the fall part of the story, you also talk about a paradigm for suffering in our culture. What would you say?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to go back and agree with, particularly maybe one of the most recent books is Tim Keller's book on suffering, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, I think is what it's called. But he just talks about the fact that we as Americans really don't have a paradigm for suffering. We don't have a good understanding of why we suffer or what to do with the suffering when it comes. And so, therefore, we do everything we can not to suffer. Happiness really does become our aim. Comfort, ease becomes our aim. And so we do everything we can to distract ourselves from suffering or to numb ourselves out when we do suffer. So we see a lot of addictions and overindulgence, whether that's food or shopping or sex or substances. And we even begin to engage in relationships as a way to look at how people can help us feel comforted or numbed out, or just, you're here to make me happy. And so, yeah, it's very, very interesting to unpack. Tim Keller unpacks in that book that other traditional cultures have paradigms for suffering. They may not be a biblical paradigm. Excuse me, they do have a paradigm for suffering. And then without one, Americans are left not knowing where to turn when they suffer. But just to inject here, like, that's why you and I both believe suffering is such a great place for Christians to enter into people's lives, because we do bring a paradigm for suffering, and we do have a Savior who's willing to suffer. And so we just have a wonderful opportunity to enter into a place of suffering. When our culture is not giving an answer for why do we suffer, we can.
Yeah, amen to that. And that leads us just right into the next part of the story, and that's redemption. You know, where do we, as in our American tradition, so to speak, typically look for a rescue, a refuge, the resources to get us through the journey? And I think we can go back to some of the things we've already talked about. We're trying to cover our suffering, to cover our pain, to cover our shame, busyness and addictions and distractions and accolades of men. You know, I'm a self-made man, I'm a self-made woman. It's very, very much wrapped up in self, and it's very, very opposite of what the gospel says of where we need to go to look for salvation.
And then finally, where do we look for our hope and peace as Americans? And our view of happiness is, I think we see, when I'm happy and the people I love are happy, then I'm going to have peace and I'm going to have wholeness. And that just kind of, again, when we look at an American view of happiness, we see, like, I need to be happy and those around me need to be happy,
which is an unsustainable hope in a fallen world. Right? Like, there's never a time I'm going to always be happy and all my people are always going to be happy. It just ain't going to happen on this side of heaven. I think what would be really interesting for our listeners is maybe to take this, and now with what we've been teaching, that they could go back and write, well, what is God's paradigm for joy and peace? And, you know, what the Bible would call shalom. Like, go back through the story. And if this is kind of like the American mindset, well, this is man's kingdom. What does joy and peace and wholeness look like in the context of God's story? And so rather than giving those answers, we're going to let you do the work,
right?
and go back from what you learned from the series and see, can you map that on to this paradigm of God's story?
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, when we did this, Brenda, we're not trying to be critical of Americans. We're just trying to recognize, number one, if you're American and you're hearing this and you think, I don't view happiness that way, that's because of what we said earlier. You have your own unique interpretive lens.
Yeah.
What we were looking at, as if you look at America across the world, that we Americans do tend to have a particular view of happiness. And even if you don't think you've been influenced by that, if you grew up in this country, to some degree you probably have. Even if your family didn't adopt this view of happiness through advertising, marketing, people like we are all influenced by this, and again, we did this just to be able to take one thing that would feel common to all of us and be able to walk through it, to be able to show in the particular what a competing worldview looks like. But there are lots of ways to be able to recognize competing worldviews, so we can pick up. I think we encouraged people in a previous episode to begin to look for the rhythm of God's story in other stories. We would also encourage people to look at the competing worldview that's being given in other stories. So if you pick up a book or if you watch a movie, to be able to see what worldview is being portrayed there. One of the places I used to do this, and I think you did too when your children were little, is I was a mom that let my kids watch the Disney movies, but they knew that when the Disney movie was over, I was going to turn it off and we were going to talk about it. And it was amazing to see that from actually pretty young, there were things that my kids could begin to understand didn't line up with what they were learning about God's Word. And we would begin to compare the Disney story to God's story. There's some wonderful ways that Disney stories actually show us things about God's story. I mean, there's always a search for redemption. There's a hero, and a lot of those heroes display Christ-like qualities. But there are also ways that Disney stories compete with God's story, and that's what we would talk about. My kids would groan as soon as the movie was over, and I would turn off the TV because they knew the discussion that was coming.
Okay, so the moral of the story is don't torture your kids. Just kind of sneak it in.
Yeah. How do you be a little more subtle than I was? Yeah.
Well, I did the same thing similar with a book club one time, and I really liked it. We would pick secular books, and then we would read them with this in mind, like what worldview. And I was thinking, what a great tool this is, whether you're in a book club or a movie club, to be able to watch or read and then sharpen your ability to, rejoice and praise God for what is good in the story, what mimics God's story, but also to be listening and identifying where the competing stories are coming in. And honestly, Alex, I think it'd be a great evangelistic tool, because you don't have to bring somebody else and say, we're going to compare everything to God's story, but you can lay out, like, there's this, this is a pattern for storytelling. I mean, we know this just from the hero's journey, a way of looking at story. Right. And so I think it could just be really fun and interactive to get a group of people together and say, now we want to just go through and allow for everybody's worldview in an evangelistic opportunity, that you get to share your worldview and I get to share mine as we come together and we talk. So I don't know. I just like that idea. Maybe I'll do that.
Yeah, and I really like that you mentioned, like, we can start with where that we agree. Like, that's just such a good place to start, and to not just skip to where we disagree, but that God's story gives us a place where we can recognize where we agree, what we hold in common, and then we can move into what's competing. I think that's what Paul did in the New Testament church. He'd go into these cities and he'd find the places where he found commonality, and he would start there. It's the way our brains work best, like how we learn best is to start with what we know and then move to what we don't know. And so I also think it's just a real engaging, winsome way to talk to people and bring them into this idea that God has a big story and that we want to bring them into that orientation. So let's start with what they know and where their story lines up, and then let's move to where there's some differences.
Yeah, that's great. Well, gosh, this has been really fun. I've really enjoyed this episode, and so sharpening and so encouraging as well. Just just this reality that we actually own the only true story of the world, because God has given that to us believers, and we need to know His story. We need to have it as that interpretive grid or lens as we filter competing stories in our own life. And then I think as we listen to others, we can listen for those competing stories to help bring them back into God's story, to help them not only know a better story, but to live a bigger story, which is just the beautiful way that God has intended for us to live. Like, again, the good story, the best story is God's story, and it's the story that is lived out of His story that is going to be the best story of all.
Yeah, when you're saying that, you're reminding me that when Marty Solomon was on and talking about just God's story. Marty Solomon is the host of the Bema podcast, and he's always challenging his listeners to trust the story. Trust the story. And that's really the invitation of every person we encounter and ourselves is, will we trust God's story? And so we hope that this series has been one, this season has been one where people are gaining familiarity with God's story, and also that they are, because of that familiarity, able to identify these places where they're not trusting the story because other competing stories have pulled them away from God's story. And one of the things I want to encourage people is that when I taught this material recently to a group of people, my pastor Adam came in to meet the group, and I asked him the question, I hope I hadn't already shared this, but I asked him the question, how many times did you need to hear this material before it began to really be gel to the point that it became a framework that you could use, that you could think through? And he said probably 4 or 5 times. And so I just want to encourage people that if you're hearing this for the first time, it feels abstract, it feels unfamiliar, and therefore it feels uncomfortable. You don't need to be able to do this to this level of engaging with competing stories right away. You're going to have to continue to engage with God's story. You're going to have to practice, so to speak, thinking through this paradigm, and it will come together. Particularly if you will interact with it, it will come together in your mind, and you will find yourself being able to think through this interpretive grid. You'll be able to evaluate other stories and recognize what's competing. So don't lose heart, persevere, keep going, and allow yourself to wrestle through the uncomfortable part of not understanding this.
Yeah. I want to say one more thing, Alex, and that is you have a class, a 6-week class that you take people through, and our hope is to actually record that class and make it available on our website, which will just be a tremendous asset for people who want to go back and actually be able to see your stick drawings and evaluate your artwork.
I feel like you're doing this to hold me accountable, and I really appreciate what you're doing.
I am holding you accountable because I know some people who have taken the class and said it was excellent. So hopefully we'll get that up and make that available to people as well.